Jarrod Schulz built something most people only dream about: a business, a brand, a family shown to millions. By his mid-40s, he had everything. Then, in a single moment, it collapsed. Not slowly, not quietly, all at once. The man viewers watched for years on national television became someone almost unrecognizable. What went wrong, and when it actually started, is a story far more complicated than any headline captured. Stay with this one. Before the cameras found him, before the storage units, before the bidding wars and the television contracts and the millions of people watching from their living rooms, Jarrod Schulz was just a young man from Orange County, California, trying to figure out his place in the world. He didn't come from money. He didn't come from stability. The early years of his life carried the kind of quiet difficulty that doesn't make headlines but shapes everything that comes after. The instability of his upbringing left impressions, the kind that don't disappear when circumstances improve. They travel with a person. They surface at unexpected moments. And in Jarrod's case, they would eventually surface in front of millions. By the time A&E Storage Wars premiered in December 2010, Jarrod was in his early 30s. He and his long-term partner, Brandy Passani, co-owned a resale shop called Now and then secondhand store in Orange, California. It wasn't a glamorous business. It was real work, sourcing inventory, managing overhead, showing up every day and hoping the numbers made sense. That grounded reality is exactly what the show's producers recognized when they came calling. And the audience recognized it too. At its peak, Storage Wars pulled over 6 million viewers per episode. That is not a small number. That is a cultural moment. Among the cast, which included seasoned dealers and larger-than-life personalities, Jarrod stood out not because he was the most polished, but because he was the most human. He made mistakes on camera. He got frustrated. He celebrated loudly when things went right. Viewers didn't just watch him. They rooted for him. But even in those early seasons, something was building beneath the surface. The pressure of sudden visibility. The weight of representing a family business on national television. The expectation to perform not just as a buyer, but as a personality, a partner, a provider. What was actually happening inside that pressure is something the cameras never fully captured. And that gap between what viewers saw and what was real, that gap is where the story truly begins. By 2012, Storage Wars wasn't just a television show anymore. It was a franchise, merchandise spin-offs, increased production schedules. The machine had grown far larger than anyone in the original cast had anticipated. And for Jarrod and Brandy, the spotlight that once felt like a lucky break had quietly become something much harder to carry. Fame has a particular way of distorting reality. On screen, everything looked like momentum, a growing business, a recognizable brand, a couple that audiences genuinely loved watching. In 2014, A&E gave them their own spin-off series, Brandy and Jarrod. Married to the Job, a deeper look into their daily lives, their relationship dynamics, and the pressure of running a business while raising a family under constant observation. The title itself was telling. Married to the job, not to each other, to the work, to the hustle, to the performance of a life that was simultaneously real and constructed for consumption. Reality television has a specific and well-documented cruelty. It takes ordinary people, places them inside an extraordinary context, and then edits their lives into something digestible for entertainment. What gets left on the cutting room floor is everything that makes a person complicated. The exhaustion, the doubt, the conversations that happen after crew leaves, and the house goes quiet. Those who follow the show closely began to notice subtle shifts in Jarrod's on-screen energy. His humor, which had always been one of his most likable qualities, started to carry an edge. Small frustrations played out in front of the camera in ways that felt less like personality and more like strain. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would raise immediate alarm. Just a man who looked, at times, like he was running on empty. Brandy, by contrast, grew more confident as the years progressed. She found her footing in front of the camera. She developed her own voice, her own presence. The dynamic between them, which had always been part of the show's appeal, began to shift in ways that were subtle but visible. What the audience was watching and what was actually unfolding behind those smiles were two entirely different stories. and the distance between them was growing. The announcement came in 2019. Quietly, without drama, Brandy Passani confirmed what many fans had already begun to suspect. She and Jarrod had separated. The relationship that had played out across nearly a decade of television, the bickering, the laughter, the shared victories inside dusty storage units, was over. For the audience, it landed like a slow exhale. Not a shock, exactly, but a sadness. The kind that comes when something you quietly hope would work out finally doesn't. What made it more complicated was the timeline. Brandy indicated the separation had not just happened. It had happened some time before the public announcement, which meant that for a period, an unclear, uncomfortable period, both had continued appearing in media, maintaining public personas, while privately navigating the end of a relationship that had defined both of their adult lives. They were never legally married. That detail surprised many viewers who had followed them for years. The spin-off title, the shared business, the children, the life built together, all of it existed outside the formal institution that most people assumed had been there. It was a small fact that somehow made the separation feel larger. For Jarrod, the weight of this loss was difficult to overstate. Brandy wasn't simply a romantic partner. She was his business anchor, his co-parent, the person whose presence had given the public version of his life its shape and its meaning. Losing that relationship meant losing multiple things at once, and losing them all in a season of life when rebuilding feels significantly harder than it did at 25. In the months that followed, those paying attention to both of their social media presences noticed a clear divergence. Brandy moved forward with intention, new ventures, new confidence, a woman stepping into the next chapter of her life with visible purpose. Jarrod's presence told a different story, more reactive, more scattered, occasionally raw in ways that felt less like honesty and more like someone struggling to find solid ground. But the hardest chapter was still ahead, and almost no one saw it coming. October 2021. That is the month everything that had been building quietly, privately, beneath years of public performance, finally broke into the open. Jarrod Schulz was arrested in Orange County on a misdemeanor domestic battery charge. The incident allegedly involved Brandy Passani. The details were sparse in the initial reports, but the charge itself was unambiguous. And for the millions of people who had spent years watching these two people build a life together on screen, the news was difficult to process. The internet reacted immediately. Comment sections filled. Old clips were re-examined. Opinions formed fast, the way they always do when a public figure's private life becomes breaking news. Some responded with anger, some with disappointment. A smaller number responded with something closer to grief, the particular grief of watching someone you rooted for become someone you no longer recognize. But here is what the headlines didn't say, what they rarely say in moments like these. Domestic incidents of this nature almost never exist in isolation. Research from organizations like the National Domestic Violence Hotline and the American Psychological Association consistently points to the same pattern. These moments are typically the visible surface of something much deeper: accumulated stress, unresolved conflict, substance use, mental health struggles that went unaddressed for too long, a breaking point that didn't arrive suddenly but had been building for years. None of that context excuses what happened. That needs to be stated clearly. But context matters when the goal is understanding, and understanding is the only thing that leads anywhere useful. Jarrod pleaded no contest to the charge. He was sentenced to 3 years of probation, mandatory domestic violence counseling, and community service. No prison time. But the consequences extended far beyond the legal outcome. His public reputation, already fragile after the separation, collapsed almost entirely. Sponsorships disappeared. Media coverage turned. The audience that had once cheered for him in storage unit auctions now associated his name with something far more serious. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, 2 children were watching their father's life unravel in real time. That weight belongs in this story, because it changes everything about how the rest of it feels. After October 2021, Jarrod Schulz largely disappeared from public view. Not completely, not all at once, but gradually, in the way that people retreat when the world outside feels too loud and too unforgiving. His social media activity became sparse. Television opportunities dried up. The version of his life that had once been packaged and broadcast to millions quietly went dark. Brandy continued building. She launched new business ventures, maintained her social media presence with consistency, and moved forward in a way that was visible and purposeful. She had rebuilt her identity outside of the shared story. Jarrod, by contrast, seemed to be still inside it, still standing in the wreckage of something that had already ended. There is a specific kind of pain that comes with this particular combination of losses: a relationship, a career, a public identity, a legal record, all of it arriving within a compressed window of time, leaving almost no space to process one thing before the next one lands. Psychologists who study life transitions refer to this as cumulative loss, the point at which individual hardships stop being separate events and begin functioning as a single, overwhelming weight. For men of Jarrod's generation, that weight is especially difficult to put down, not because they feel it less, but because they were handed almost no tools for carrying it. Research from the American Psychological Association has documented this pattern extensively. Men are statistically less likely to seek mental health support during periods of crisis. They are more likely to internalize, to isolate, to externalize frustration in ways that damage the relationships around them. The cultural messaging many men absorb growing up, that struggle should be silent, that asking for help is weakness, doesn't disappear when life gets hard. It just makes hard things harder. Whether Jarrod sought professional support during this period is not publicly known. What is known is that the silence that followed his collapse was long, and silence, in situations like this, is rarely peace. If any part of the story feels familiar, if someone watching this is carrying something similar, that recognition matters. These patterns are more common than most people admit. Some stories don't end with a clear resolution. No redemption arc tied neatly together. No public apology that fixes everything. No moment where the cameras return and the audience gets to feel good again. Jarrod Schulz's story, at least for now, is one of those. At 48, he exists largely outside the spotlight that once defined him. The business he built with Brandy. The television career that made his face recognizable to millions. The relationship that anchored everything gone. What remains is harder to see from the outside. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be, because the most important rebuilding rarely happens in public. Reality television as an industry has a documented pattern of consuming its participants and moving on. The production companies find new faces. The networks chase new formats. The audience shifts its attention. And the people who were placed in front of cameras, ordinary individuals who were never trained for sustained public exposure, are left to reconstruct their lives without the infrastructure that created the spotlight in the first place. Jarrod is not alone in this. Across the reality television landscape, the list of participants who experienced serious personal collapse after their moment in the public eye is long and largely unacknowledged. The industry rarely looks back. It almost never takes responsibility. His children are growing up now. They have access to everything, every article, every arrest record, every comment section, every opinion that strangers formed about their father without knowing him. Processing that inheritance will be its own kind of work, the kind that takes years and quiet conversations and patience that can't be rushed. And Jarrod himself, whatever private journey he is on, is still only 48. That is not the end of the story. It is, if the choice is made, the beginning of a different one, not a televised comeback, not a public redemption designed for consumption, something quieter and more durable than that, the kind of change that doesn't need an audience to be real. And if there is one thing a story leaves behind beyond the headlines, beyond the court records, beyond the comment sections, it is this: public collapse is visible, but private rebuilding is possible. And sometimes that possibility is the most honest thing left to say.